The Starlight Ballroom had been polished within an inch of its reputation. Brass rails shone like coins newly rubbed on a sleeve, and the great mirrored wall opposite the bandstand doubled the glitter so that even a modest village girl felt for a moment as if she were stepping into a picture. Miss Marple, who had not stepped out to dance for many years and did not intend to start again, sat in a little gilt chair near a palm in a tin tub and watched the evening with the quiet interest of a naturalist at the edge of a pond. Young people, she reflected, were not so very different from waterboatmen, darting, circling, showing off their balance and their sheen. The older ones, she thought, were more like pond snails, clinging to the familiar while appearing to drift. It was an opening night. A new proprietor, Mrs. Dalrymple, brisk, capable, too quick in her speech, had taken the old cinema and turned it into a ballroom with a skylight of glass panels painted with stars. "The Starlight," she said earlier to anyone who would listen, "is going to bring the modern world to our little town." That had not pleased everyone. The vicar's wife had sighed, the butcher's wife had sniffed, and 2 councilmen had taken to speaking in low, portentous voices about late hours and young morals. But they were here all the same in their best, because one does go to an opening, even if only to say afterward that one had gone, and it was not as good as it might have been. Miss Marple was not strictly a local. She had come with the Bantrys from St. Mary Mead, delighted by the promise of a proper orchestra and the excuse to wear a lace fichu that had survived 3 generations of lavender sachets. On the bandstand, Mr. Victor Harrow, sleek hair, sleek smile, raised his baton and the first foxtrot unfurled. The floor manager, Fred Pargeter, slid about like a well-oiled hinge, attending to chairs, to spilled lemonade, to the small disputes of who had been promised to whom for the next dance. If there was tension, it ran under the surface like a taut string. Miss Marple noticed the little things, the way Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes sharpened when she spoke to the councilman with the carnation, the quick, stealthy glance the seamstress, Lily Prowse, cast toward the stairs that led up to the small row of offices, the exaggerated indifference of a young woman in a silver-starred frock as she laughed too brightly at some remark of Mr. Harrow's. It was like watching someone's drawing room when the cat is under the sofa and the birdcage door is not quite latched. Nothing happened yet, but every creature in the room knew what could. Between dances there was a small crisis with a hem. The silver-starred frock belonged to a clever little dancer who had been promised the waltz demonstration later. "It will not do," Mrs. Dalrymple said, sharp as a paper cut. "Lily, pins. Quickly, you'll have to take it up a half-inch." "No, we cannot have her treading on the stars. Think, child." Lily Prowse hurried, work basket in the crook of her arm. There was a smudge of blue chalk on her fingers, the sort dressmakers use, and a thread trailing from her cuff like a filament of spider web. Miss Marple smiled at her. Lily smiled back, quick and tired, and then was gone behind the velvet curtain toward the stair. The orchestra played again. Couples flowed out. On the 3rd dance, Mr. Harrow lifted a hand to quiet the applause. "A novelty," he announced, and his voice slid over the room like warm syrup. "A very small surprise for our very special evening. Ladies and gentlemen, the Starlight Waltz." At that, the floor manager dimmed the wall sconces until the ballroom turned the color of honey. The painted glass ceiling glowed faintly. Then, at the stroke of Mr. Harrow's baton, the lights went out altogether for 8 bars, and a hushed murmur ran round as silver paper stars began to drift down from the ceiling, released from some contrivance hidden under the rafters. There were small, breathless squeals as the stars brushed hair and shoulders, and the band, well rehearsed, played on in the dark, the violins unflustered. The scream did not belong to the music. It came sharp and human from somewhere beyond. The bandstand. The lights snapped on too bright, as if eager to prove they had not colluded. There was a stir, a shuffling, an unsightly scrambling for dignity. Miss Marple's hand, which had been quietly folded on her handbag, tightened a little. The floor manager was already moving, but the way he moved, as if he knew exactly where to go, told Miss Marple that the scream had not surprised him altogether. "Nothing to worry about," he called out, which, as everyone knows, is the surest way to fan worry. He disappeared behind the velvet curtain at the side of the bandstand, where the stairs rose to the line of office doors. Tiny rooms, one for accounts, one for the telephone, and one, Mrs. Dalrymple's own, facing the landing with a frosted glass panel. Miss Marple, who did not push but also did not get in anyone's way, found herself quietly at the fringe of the little knot that formed around the landing. The door with the frosted pane was shut. The key hung from the inside. Through the ripple of glass, an indistinct shape lay in a posture that had no business with office furniture. Fred Pargeter rattled the handle, then said hoarsely, "Help!" and two men took turns throwing their shoulders against it. The cheap wood gave with a long, splintering moan. Mrs. Dalrymple lay on the carpet with her arm crooked under her, in a way that suggested the fall had come all of a piece. There was a neat inward wound to the left of the breastbone that had bled as little as it needed to. You could have mistaken it for a puncture left by something like a hatpin, if hatpins were still common. But then, fashions have a way of leaving their weapons behind. Her eyes were open and quite unexpectedly for one so practical, very surprised, "Doctor," someone said. But the doctor was already there. In small towns, doctors arrive at social functions almost as reliably as the band. He knelt, did what doctors do, and rose with a grave economical shake of the head. "Heart," a hopeful voice suggested, as if respectability might yet be salvaged. The doctor's glance took in the wound, the depth of it, the angle. "No," he said. "No." The room had only the one door and the one small window. The window was shut and bolted. The door they had forced had been locked from within, the key still dangling from the inside as stupidly as a tongue. There was no balcony, no obliging ventilation shaft, no trick transom that might be slid back. On the carpet near her hand lay one of the paper stars that had been falling in the dark. But this one was wrong. Not silver, not glossy, but a flat, faintly green speckled paper, such as one sees in pattern envelopes. In its center there was a tiny puncture, as if it had been pushed once onto a pin. Miss Marple stooped, not so far as to be objectionable, and saw on Mrs. Dalrymple's fingertips the faintest dusting of something blue. Chalk, the sort dressmakers use, and not much of it. Her glance took in the desk, a ledger open to a page headed with a column of names and shillings, an empty tumbler with a smear of coral lipstick, a bottle of scent with its stopper tipped as if it had been set down in a hurry. On the edge of the desk lay a single satin glove turned wrong side out, its fingers sagging like a row of small empty stockings. The glove had smears of glitter on its inner seams, so that the sparkle sat where it had no business to sit. "Who found her?" asked a voice that was all authority and no patience. Inspector Slack had arrived like February weather. "I did," said Fred Pargeter. He had the bloodless look of a man who has got what he expected and not in a way that benefits him. "I heard, well, that scream, and I thought it best to check. I tried the door and it was fast. She keeps it locked sometimes, what with the takings." "Who else has a key?" Slack demanded. "No one," he said, a shade too quickly. "Only Mrs. Dalrymple. She always said duplicates were the beginning of mischief." Miss Marple watched, the faces as if they were pages to be turned. The councilman with the carnation was more offended than shocked. Lily Prowse had joined them breathless, one hand clutching her work-basket as if it were a small animal. A single blue chalk smudge marked her thumb. The silver-starred young woman stood back, very straight, infinitely conscious of her frock. As girls are when the worst thing is happening, and they must not on any account crease the bodice. "Lights out," Inspector Slack grunted. "Convenient, and during your, what was it, Starlight waltz." "Who planned that?" Mr. Harrow smiled with admirable restraint. "A little effect," he said. "Part of the evening's charm, timed switch. Mr. Pargeter saw to it." There was pride in it, and perhaps a thread of self-preservation. And in that darkness, Slack went on, someone did this, and locked the door and flew away like a fairy. His tone made it plain what he thought of fairies. Miss Marple did not look at the wound. She looked at the glove turned inside out, at the wrong sort of star on the carpet, at the faint sprinkle of blue on a dead woman's fingers. She remembered, as she often did, a dozen small past incidents. Mrs. Price Ridley's habit of pushing pins through paper to keep them from rolling. Young Cherry Baker turning a glove the wrong way to hide a stain. The night Mrs. Bartlett locked herself in her larder and had to be rescued through the scullery window. The way girls will shorten a hem by a desperate half-inch and tell no one. These were not dramatic things, but the dramatic thing in front of them might be made from such materials. "Who screamed?" Miss Marple asked, very gently, as if inquiring whether anyone wanted tea. There was a silence. Then the silver-starred girl said, "I did, only because something brushed my face in the dark. One of those silly stars, I suppose. It felt sticky." "Sticky?" Inspector Slack pounced. "It clung a moment. Like a sweet that's fallen in sugar," she said, and then looked as if she had revealed something foolish. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the faint glitter smudged inside the wrong-way glove. Sugar will hold glitter better than any gum, she remembered. And if one wished a thing to cling for exactly so long, one might dust it first. The star on the carpet with its punctured center might have been pushed onto a pin and sugared, and then, well, then a hand in the dark might have found it, and the hand that found it might bear blue chalk. Or not. One should not hop to conclusions, the way a robin hops to the first worm of the day. But there are worms, to be sure, and robins do not starve. Inspector Slack rattled the window, held up the key, scowled at the bolt. "Locked from inside," he said in a tone that had never admitted defeat. "No other door, an office too small for tricks, an impossible crime." He seemed to enjoy hating the phrase. Miss Marple smoothed the lace at her throat. "Oh, dear," she said mildly. "Impossible things do so often turn out to be merely domestic." She looked with that mildness at the little star that did not shine, at the glove that glittered in the wrong place, at the seamstress clutching her basket, and at the band leader who had arranged the darkness. And she thought, not unkindly, that somewhere in what everyone already knew lay the very simple way a woman had been killed in a locked room. Inspector Slack had begun his work with the briskness of a man who liked his cases orderly. He sent one constable to fetch the photographer, another to guard the stair, and he himself began questioning witnesses with a pencil already smudged from heavy use. But while his questions struck like blows, "Where were you? Who saw you? Why scream?" Miss Marple's eyes moved more gently, pausing over details as if they were blooms in a hedgerow. The office, now crowded with townsfolk whispering at the doorway, seemed too small to contain so much confusion. Yet it was not the obvious that caught Miss Marple's eye, but the little scraps that others stepped over. Near the wastebasket lay a scrap of pattern tissue, delicate as onion skin, printed with blue lines. It looked ordinary enough, yet it was oddly crumpled, as if clenched hard in a fist before being discarded. Beside the ledger on the desk, a fountain pen lay uncapped, its nib bent, which suggested it had been dropped in haste. The tumbler with the coral lipstick mark seemed to have been set down without the matching bottle of lemonade nearby, an oddity in itself, for Mrs. Dalrymple was not the type to drink plain water. Slack demanded, "Who last saw her alive?" And Fred Pargeter replied with a clipped voice, "Just before the Starlight Waltz. She was in her office counting the evening's intake." His answer came too quickly, as though rehearsed, and his eyes kept darting, not at the body nor the inspector, but at Lily Prowse clutching her sewing basket. Miss Marple noted the tremor in Lily's hand and the way she rubbed her thumb against her skirt to rid herself of the faint blue chalk dust. When Slack turned to the silver-frocked dancer, she gave her account with fluttering breaths. She had screamed when something sticky brushed her face in the dark. "A star," she insisted, though her eyes flickered toward the glove inside out on the desk. "It clung here." She touched her cheek lightly, as though the memory still shivered on her skin. The inspector grunted, unimpressed, but Miss Marple's gaze lingered. A fleck of glitter remained at the corner of the girl's hairline, not where one would expect from paper stars falling above, but lower at the edge of her temple, as if pressed against her by another hand. Miss Marple bent very slowly and retrieved the wrong paper star from the carpet. "Dear me," she murmured. "This one is not like the others. Homemade, I think, and pierced neatly in the center." Slack barely spared it a glance. "Children's rubbish," he said, already moving to examine the lock again. But Miss Marple thought of Cherry Baker, once pricking paper with pins to keep them orderly, and she thought again of the blue dust on Mrs. Dalrymple's fingertips, the same shade now dulling Lily's thumb. The witnesses trickled back to the ballroom, murmurs spreading like spilled ink. Slack left a constable at the door and began a brusque search of the office. He noted the locked window, rattled the bolt, and declared, "It's clear enough. Either she locked it herself or our murderer has vanished into thin air." Miss Marple, however, saw that the ledge of the window was faintly smeared, as if brushed by a hand not trying to escape, but steadying itself. On the sill clung the faint scent of Mrs. Dalrymple's perfume, though the bottle stood unopened. On the desk. She touched her fichu thoughtfully. Someone had steadied themselves here, but not left by it. Returning to the gathering below, Miss Marple listened as Slack interviewed the councilman with the carnation. He was stiff with indignation, protesting his innocence before accusation came. His protest was almost too loud, but Miss Marple found his vanity more interesting than his alibi. He worried over his flower, fretting with the stem, until she noticed a faint glimmer of sugar grain clinging to one petal, the sort of stickiness that matched the silver-frocked girl's complaint. The orchestra, dismissed to the far end of the hall, smoked and muttered. Mr. Harrow, ever suave, professed outrage that his carefully rehearsed stunt, the lights out, the raining stars, had been abused by some criminal. Yet his smoothness held a brittle edge. Miss Marple remembered his boast that Mr. Pargeter had managed the timed switch. His eyes flicked often to the stairwell, as though calculating how long the inspector would keep them all. Quietly, Miss Marple approached Lily Prowse. "Such a pretty frock," she said, nodding to the silver-starred girl across the room. "I thought you very clever with the hem." Lily's lips quivered. It wasn't pinned right. I had to run for more chalk. She wouldn't wait, Mrs. Dalrymple. Said the girl must look perfect. Her eyes brimmed with something like anger and fear mingled. Miss Marple touched her arm kindly. "Yes, dear. Sometimes perfection is rather dearly bought." When Slack returned, notebook heavy with scribble, he declared, "It's locked room and one of you did it. Simple as that." But Miss Marple, in her mildest voice, corrected him. "Not simple at all, Inspector. For locked doors can be arranged, stars can be altered, and screams can be rehearsed. But the little things, misplaced chalk, a glove turned, the wrong way sugar where it does not belong, those are harder to contrive. And it is always the little things, you know, that point the way." Slack frowned, unused to contradiction, yet her words drew a hush. For in the ballroom filled with glitter and music, it was the small homely traces, the seamstress's chalk, the wrong paper star, the bent pen, that began to whisper of murder more clearly than any grand locked door impossibility. And Miss Marple, with her sharp, unwinking gaze, saw that whisper more keenly than anyone else in the room. Inspector Slack gathered them in the ballroom, where the orchestra had fallen silent and the mirrored wall reflected a dozen uneasy faces. The gaiety had drained out like water from a cracked vase. Chairs scraped, coughs sounded too loud, and the faint rustle of the paper stars underfoot gave the room an oddly festive air, at odds with the body lying upstairs. Miss Marple sat quietly among them, knitting a line or two, as though nothing more. Serious than a village jumble sale were under discussion, but her eyes never left the faces. Slack began with Fred Pargeter, whose role as floor manager had already made him indispensable and suspect in equal measure. "You say you heard the scream and went straight to Mrs. Dalrymple's office?" Slack demanded. Pargeter nodded stiffly. "Yes, I thought she might have tripped. She was never steady on her feet when she hurried. But you didn't check the ballroom floor first, you went directly upstairs." Pargeter's eyes darted sideways. "It was instinct. I'd been near the stairs when the lights went out." Miss Marple looked down at her knitting. He was lying. Instinct rarely explained the certainty in his step when he had vanished behind the curtain. She remembered the way he had moved. Decisive, straight for the office door, without a moment wasted on hesitation. That was not instinct, but foreknowledge. Slack called next the girl in the silver-starred frock, who now twisted her sequined skirt between nervous fingers. "I screamed," she said. "I felt something brush me in the dark, sticky like syrup. It frightened me." "Sticky," Slack pressed. "And yet you didn't stumble or cry out again." "I brushed it away." Her voice rose. It was only for a moment. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the girl. Her story had not changed since earlier, but the flutter in her tone seemed rehearsed. A girl, truly startled, would be less concerned about how she looked, more disordered in speech. This one stood straight-backed, determined to seem delicate, though Miss Marple noticed the glitter in her hair had been carefully smoothed away since before. Only the faintest trace remained, hidden at her temple. Lily Prowse was summoned next. She clutched her sewing basket as though it were a shield. "Mrs. Dalrymple sent me up for pins," she said quickly. "I left my chalk behind, so I ran back for it. But I never saw her. The scream came while I was below, near the dressing corner." "Yet chalk dust was found on her hands," Slack said bluntly. Lily blanched. I don't know. She must have touched my basket earlier. I'd been with her to show the fabric." Her denial came too fast, too eager. Miss Marple's fingers stilled for a moment in the yarn. The girl's explanation was plausible, but her trembling betrayed the deeper truth. Lily had seen more than she dared admit. Perhaps she feared to speak not for herself, but for another. Slack turned to Victor Harrow, the band leader. His dark hair gleamed with oil, and his smile seemed polished even under suspicion. "It was my idea, Inspector, the Starlight Waltz," he said smoothly. A harmless bit of theatre. "Lights down, paper stars, nothing sinister." "And you timed it?" "The floor manager did. I merely conducted the band." Miss Marple listened keenly. Harrow spoke as though rehearsed for a stage, his every phrase rounded and self-protective, but she caught the faint tightening of his mouth when Slack pressed about the switch. Harrow wanted distance from Pargeter's work, yet not too much, like a man trying to balance on both sides of a plank. The councilman with the carnation sat pompous in his chair. "Disgraceful business," he declared before any question was put. "The whole thing smacks of negligence. I was on the floor with Mrs. Pargeter's cousin. I never left her side. Who can confirm this? My partner, of course." His eyes flicked toward a flustered matron who nodded hurriedly. But Miss Marple noted that his carnation drooped, one petal oddly stiff, with something that glittered faintly under the lamplight. Sugar, perhaps. She remembered how he had fussed with it earlier, as if guilty hands needed occupation. Slack moved heavily through his questions, scratching notes, brow furrowed in concentration. He listened for facts. Miss Marple listened for tones, hesitations, and the tiny betrayals of expression. Each story fit roughly like puzzle pieces hammered into place. Yet the seams gaped with contradictions. The girl in the silver frock had claimed her brush with something sticky occurred on the ballroom floor. But Miss Marple had seen glitter clinging higher than falling stars would reach, at the temple where a hand might have pressed in darkness. Lily swore she had not entered the office, yet the chalk on Mrs. Dalrymple's fingers suggested contact, however brief. Harrow denied involvement beyond music, but his eagerness to cast responsibility onto Pargeter betrayed a nervous self-interest. And the councilman's flower, sugar-dusted, linked him in some unexplained way to the glittered glove upstairs. When Slack dismissed them in weary frustration, Miss Marple remained seated, her needles clicking softly. She spoke almost to herself, though those nearest bent to listen. People are so often careless in their accounts. They say what ought to be true rather than what is, and in their eagerness, they forget the small things. A glove turned wrong way, a scrap of paper where no paper belongs, a sticky touch in the dark. Such little things. Slack scowled, for he disliked being reminded that his hammer missed the tiny nails. But Miss Marple had already withdrawn into her knitting, her eyes half-lidded, listening still to the echoes of their words. Deception had filled the ballroom as thickly as music once had, and in that chorus of falsehoods she had begun to hear the faint, true note beneath. The murderer had spoken, just as all of them had, but not every voice told the same song. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was already sorting melody from noise. The ballroom emptied slowly, like a tide retreating against its will. Inspector Slack barked his orders. Constables at the doors, statements collected, no one to leave town until he said so. Yet the villagers, stubborn in their own ways, clustered in uneasy knots, whispering about who had been where, who had screamed, who had most to gain. Miss Marple sat at the edge of it all, the soft click of her knitting needles sounding as steady as a clock. She was not hurried. She knew the truth often lay tangled, and knots must be teased, not hacked. Everywhere she looked, she saw motive. Mrs. Dalrymple, brisk and ambitious, had gathered resentments as carelessly as she gathered ticket sales. The councilman with the carnation had protested against the ballroom's opening. Too much noise, too much modernity. Yet he had attended with a matron on his arm and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Miss Marple thought it curious that a man so opposed would still bring flowers to pin in his lapel, as if to show he was the very soul of support. Pride bruises easily when mocked in public meetings. Could Mrs. Dalrymple's scornful tongue have driven him to violence? Fred Pargeter, the floor manager, was another knot in the string. Loyal perhaps, but to whom? His face when the body was discovered had not been surprise but resignation, as though he had long expected calamity. He had access to every detail of the evening, from the lights to the doors, and his certainty in rushing to the office suggested knowledge of more than one secret. A man in his position could gain much from Mrs. Dalrymple's downfall: promotion, ownership, or merely freedom from a woman who had kept him in her shadow. Lily Prowse, poor child, offered yet another motive. Miss Marple had seen her eyes reddened, not only by fear but by resentment. Seamstresses carry stories as carefully as stitches, and Miss Marple had heard enough murmurs to know that Mrs. Dalrymple had taken advantage of Lily's work, squeezing pennies while demanding perfection. There had been whispers, too, ugly ones, that Lily's late-night fittings with Mr. Harrow had been encouraged by Mrs. Dalrymple for the sake of show. Shame, humiliation, and bitterness could drive even the gentlest hands to violence. Victor. Harrow, the bandleader, stood apart with his smile fixed like a mask. He had insisted on his Starlight waltz with the dramatic blackout and glittering paper stars, a clever effect, but too convenient for a murderer. Miss Marple thought of his reputation: charming, a ladies' man, too quick to laugh. Mrs. Dalrymple, shrewd as she was, would never let him slip from her authority without a price. Had she discovered one flirtation too many, perhaps with the very girl in the silver-starred frock? Fear of scandal often prompts desperate acts. And then there was the girl herself, the dancer whose beauty gleamed like a coin in lamplight. She had been promised a demonstration, the spotlight of the evening, and Mrs. Dalrymple had been the one to grant or deny such privilege. Ambition can be sharper than jealousy, and Miss Marple knew well that young women sometimes strike when their glitter is threatened. The girl's story of the sticky star had been too rehearsed, too conveniently dramatic. A scream in the dark can cover many deeds. Inspector Slack, for all his bluster, felt the weight of these motives too. He declared in his broad way, "Any one of you had reason. Jealousy, money, pride, you've all got stains enough to show." But Slack's hammer struck too heavily. The motives overlapped, contradicted, and twisted like threads in a badly woven tapestry. Each strand explained one piece but never the whole. Miss Marple, meanwhile, set her mind to sorting. She remembered the glove on the desk turned inside out, the wrong kind of paper star on the carpet, the faint chalk on dead fingers, the sugared carnation petal. Each of these things belonged somewhere. In the maze of motives, like crumbs left along a path, if the councilman hated the ballroom, why bring a flower sticky with sugar? If Pargeter longed for authority, why rush so quickly as though he feared what he already knew? If Lily bore resentment, why leave chalk traces on Mrs. Dalrymple's hand unless she had been closer to her than she admitted? And if Harrow wanted a grand illusion, why did his eyes flick with unease whenever the lights-out trick was mentioned? Miss Marple thought of human nature, as she always did. She recalled small things in her own village: Mrs. Price Ridley refusing to pay the dressmaker's fee, and Lily Dawes slamming the door in tears, the way Mr. Badger, the grocer, once dusted his apples with sugar to make them shine, fooling no one but impressing himself. Greed, pride, shame, ambition, each motive different, yet all from the same root: the quiet desperation of being seen, valued, or obeyed. As she sat, knitting, growing inch by inch, she began to imagine the murder not as one grand stroke of passion, but as something domestic, practical, carried out with small objects at hand. A dressmaker's pin, a sugared star, a glove turned inside out to hide the stain. Murder, she reflected, rarely arrives with a trumpet. It slips in through familiar habits. She watched the suspects when they thought no one looked. The girl in silver turned her head often toward Harrow, eyes flashing with a kind of nervous devotion. Harrow, in turn, studied the floor manager, calculating. Lily kept her basket close, as if it were a secret she dared not drop. And the councilman fussed endlessly with his flower, not realizing each touch only deepened suspicion. Slack thundered about locked rooms, but Miss Marple heard instead the quieter music of deceit. Everyone had motive enough to kill, yet only one motive would fit neatly with the peculiar clues. The star that was not silver, the chalk on dead hands, the glove that sparkled where it should not. She had not yet untangled the whole skein, but she could feel the thread between her fingers. The maze of motives, so confusing to the inspector, was to Miss Marple like a village garden overrun with brambles. Each weed had its reason for being, there each thorn its place. What mattered was not how many tangled stems existed, but which one bore the fruit. She did not yet pluck it. She only smiled faintly, as if she already knew that the truth, however carefully hidden, would bloom soon enough. And while Slack fumed and scribbled, Miss Marple sat quietly with her knitting, thinking that the murder in the Starlight Ballroom was not a matter of grand conspiracies or impossible locks, but of the very ordinary human. The following evening, the Starlight Ballroom lay in gloom, its mirrored walls dulled, its orchestra sent home. Inspector Slack had returned with a renewed sense of determination and the sort of brisk confidence that comes when a man believes the case is nearly wrapped up. A constable, red-cheeked and breathless, had delivered what seemed to be the missing piece, a stained glove discovered in Lily Prowse's sewing basket. Inside its seams glitter clung in thick streaks, and the lining was marked with a faint, reddish smear. Blood, Slack declared, holding it aloft like a prize. And glitter, the very same that covered the dead woman's glove. Proof enough she lied about her movements, and this was her doing. His voice boomed in the deserted ballroom, echoing against the glass ceiling where painted stars watched silently. The news spread quickly, as such things do in a small town. By the time evening settled, villagers were already saying the seamstress had stabbed her employer in a fit of temper, that she had smuggled the weapon with her chalk and pins. Some swore they had seen her quarrel with Mrs. Dalrymple, others that she had cursed under her breath when the hem was inspected. Gossip grew wings, and soon it seemed no one doubted Lily's guilt except Lily herself. She stood pale and rigid before the inspector, sewing basket clutched tight to her chest. "It isn't mine," she whispered. "I never put it there. Someone must have planted it," Slack snorted. "They always say that." His notes were thick with ticks and underlines, as though each mark hammered another nail into the coffin. She had access, she had the motive, and here's the weapon. What more does one need? Miss Marple, seated quietly by the palm in the yew-way. Corner lifted her eyes from her knitting. "One needs," she said softly, "to be very sure. Because people who kill, Inspector, rarely leave such tidy parcels for you to find." Slack gave her a look of weary tolerance. Now, Miss Marple. You've your stories, but this is solid police work. A glove with blood in the seam found among her things. Why, she's practically confessed by her carelessness." But Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on Lily. The girl's trembling was not the sort of fear that comes from guilt, but from being trapped. Her protests were quiet, untheatrical, like the cry of a bird already caught in the net. Miss Marple had seen guilt before. It showed itself in small bravado, in angry outbursts, in sudden silences. This was different. Slack pressed on, eager for his triumph. He brought in Mr. Harrow, who vouched that Lily had rushed past him near the stairs, sewing basket in hand, just before the scream. "I thought nothing of it at the time," he said smoothly, "but it seems important now." To Slack, it was confirmation. To Miss Marple, it was troubling. Mr. Harrow's tone was too polished, too ready. He spoke as if he had rehearsed it, as if the discovery of the glove had been no surprise at all. The councilman with the carnation also added his voice. "I never trusted that girl," he sniffed, "always skulking about with her chalk and thread. Too much liberty, if you ask me. Now we see where liberty leads." His carnation, still sugar-stiff at the edges, trembled with each pompous word. Piece by piece, the case seemed neatly tied. Lily, near the scene, the glove in her basket. whispers of resentment, opportunity in the darkness. Slack stood taller with each statement, convinced he had uncovered the culprit. He made preparations to charge her formally, his pen scratching across the papers with a zeal that brooked no doubt. But doubt is a quiet thing. It does not shout. It lingers. Miss Marple felt it now like a thread catching on her needle. The glove in Lily's basket was too perfect, too damning. Murderers, in her experience, were seldom so obliging. They might leave traces, yes, but not gift-wrapped confessions. She recalled the inside-out glove on Mrs. Dalrymple's desk. That one had glitter too, but smudged in places where no glove should have been turned. And the wrong paper star with its sugared surface and pinprick hole, that too spoke of preparation. The murder had been arranged with thought, with cunning. Would such a murderer then simply drop the incriminating glove into a girl's basket where any curious constable might find it? That was not cunning. That was theatre. Miss Marple thought of theatre again as she watched Mr. Harrow. He smiled. Too much. Gestured too smoothly, like a man accustomed to rehearsals. The silver-frocked girl glanced often at him, her eyes shining with fear and devotion. Was it possible that the murder itself had been staged not to conceal but to direct attention, a performance with Lily as the scapegoat? She asked a small question, her voice mild. "Inspector, when the glove was found, was it at the bottom of the basket or the top?" Slack frowned. "At the top, naturally. Practically the first thing seen." "Ah," Miss Marple said gently, "but anyone who sews knows. A work basket is never so neat. Bits of cotton, pins, chalk. They settle over time. For something to be found at the top so neatly—" She let the thought trail off. Slack muttered, "Coincidence." But his voice lacked force. Lily's eyes lifted in sudden, desperate hope. "I didn't. Miss Marple, I swear." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Hush, child. Truth has a way of surfacing, even in a ballroom where stars fall from the ceiling." The inspector announced his intention to hold Lily overnight. "Villagers," murmured. Some nodded in satisfaction. Others frowned uneasily. Her current of finality seemed to settle, the kind that comes when an answer, any answer, has been offered to soothe fear. Yet Miss Marple sat back in her chair, knitting needles stilled. She could not reconcile the neatness of the evidence with the untidiness of human nature. Murder is rarely solved by the first glove one finds. The true killer, she thought, was still among them, listening, perhaps smiling to themselves at the success of their planted theatre. They had won this round hiding in the shadows while suspicion crushed another. But shadows never last. Sooner or later the light would fall, and when it did, it would reveal not just glitter and chalk, but the hand that guided them. And so, Missa? Marple watched as Lily was led away, watched the inspector straighten with his false victory, watched the suspects exhale with carefully measured relief. Somewhere among them sat the real murderer, waiting for the curtain to drop. And Miss Marple, her eyes sharp behind her gentle smile, knew the play was not yet over. Hungers that twined together until they strangled. The village awoke the following morning to the news that Lily Prowse had been taken into custody. Many felt the satisfaction of a tidy ending. The seamstress had motive, the glove was damning, and Inspector Slack's notes bristled with ticks and underlines. Yet Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the Bantry's guest room, felt no satisfaction at all. She had lived too long to mistake neatness for truth. A tidy ending, in her experience, often concealed the worst untidiness beneath. The morning paper carried a small paragraph about the tragedy at the Starlight Ballroom, written with the brisk cruelty of print. It declared that Mrs. Dalrymple had been found stabbed in her office during the grand opening, and that a local seamstress has been apprehended for questioning. Miss Marple folded the page and looked out into the garden. It was there, as she watched a blackbird tugging worms from the wet grass, that she recalled something, a memory not of St. Mary Mead, but of a case whispered years ago in another village. A woman who had run a dressmaking establishment, accused of cheating her seamstresses, had met with a suspicious accident. The whispers had never been proved, but Miss Marple remembered one name in particular that had floated about in connection. Harrow. She returned to the ballroom later that morning under the pretext of retrieving her forgotten knitting bag. The Place was hushed, shuttered, the glamour drained away. A constable nodded her inside with reluctant courtesy, and she found herself once more in that mirrored hall, now empty, save for the faint scent of last night's perfumes and dust of fallen paper stars. It was there she met an older cleaner, Mrs. Tregowan, who had worked in the building back when it was a cinema. "It fair chills the bones, ma'am," Mrs. Tregowan said, shaking out a mop. "But it's not the first." "Oh no, not the first. Folk forget, but I remember. Years ago, when it was the Regal Picture House, there was a scandal. Manager's wife was found in the office, same room as last night. Only they called it a fall, said she tripped on the stair, but I saw the bruises. Same family owned it then." As now Mrs. Dalrymple's brother-in-law, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Indeed, that is most interesting." The forgotten case, brushed aside in the town's collective memory, suddenly seemed to rise like a ghost. Another woman, another office, another accident. The Dalrymples had inherited the building not long after. What had seemed coincidence now hummed with pattern. Later, speaking to Colonel Bantry, Miss Marple pressed gently about Mrs. Dalrymple's past. He recalled in his blustering way that she had married late, after some financial trouble in her family. Her brother-in-law, Dalrymple's elder brother, lost a good deal in a shady scheme. A music hall venture, if memory serves. A fellow named Harrow was mixed up in it. Not our band leader's father by any chance. Miss Marple tucked that away like a spool of thread. Harrow again. The name seemed woven through the past like a faint repeating motif in tapestry. If the band leader's family had once been disgraced by the Dalrymples, then his presence here was no accident. And what of Lily? Miss Marple returned to the girls' lodgings and with gentle persistence drew her story out. Lily's mother had worked long ago as a seamstress under Mrs. Dalrymple's control, often cheated of wages, sometimes bullied to tears. "She hated her," Lily whispered, eyes glistening. "Said she'd ruined her life. And when she died, I took her place, only I thought I could manage better." Here was the deeper shadow, resentment that stretched across generations. The murder in the Starlight Ballroom was not only about hem lengths and unpaid wages. It was the flowering of old roots, humiliation, debts and scandals long forgotten by the inspector's notebook, but not by those who had lived them. Miss Marple visited the councilman next, under pretext of calling on his wife. She noticed his bookshelf held an old ledger tucked behind volumes of Dickens. When his back was turned, her eyes fell upon the names scrawled inside: Dalrymple, debts unpaid, civic funds misused. The man had lent money once, years ago, and been publicly mocked by Mrs. Dalrymple when he sought repayment. Pride wounded then, pride still raw now. By evening, Miss Marple saw the maze differently. Each suspect was not merely a player in last night's drama, but a carrier of older grievances. The councilman with his unpaid debts, Lily with her mother's humiliation, Harrow with his family's scandal, and even Pargeter, who had served under the Dalrymple's thumb since his youth, growing into a man forever denied authority. The glove, the glitter, the sugared star, those were the present props. But the true script had been written years before when Mrs. Dalrymple and her family sowed bitterness and shame. Murder had sprouted not in a single night's quarrel, but in soil long prepared. That evening Miss Marple sat by the fire at the Bantrys, silent while others debated Lily's guilt. She remembered Mrs. Tregowan's voice. Not the first. She remembered Colonel Bantry's casual remark about Harrow's disgraced father. She remembered Lily's trembling confession about her mother's tears. And she remembered, most of all, the faint sugared glitter on the councilman's carnation, a trace of a trick too childish for his dignity. Someone had revived old grudges and dressed them in stars and darkness. She did not yet know whose hand had struck, but she knew the strike had been sharpened by years, not hours. Shadows of the past had crept into the Starlight Ballroom, and they would not be banished by Inspector Slack's tidy arrest. Miss Marple folded her hands, her knitting lying idle in her lap. "It is all roots, you see," she said softly to herself. "Pull one weed and another rises, unless you dig to where the root begins." And in the darkness of the ballroom's history, she sensed the root at last. This crime was no isolated act, but the latest bloom of an old poisonous seed, The past had reached out its hand, and in that gesture lay the true shape of murder. The ballroom remained shuttered, its glass ceiling dull beneath a film of dust. By now the town had settled into the uneasy rhythm that follows a crime. Hushed. Talk in shop doorways, speculative glances over teacups, and a nervous eagerness to believe Inspector Slack's pronouncement that the case was solved. Lily Prowse sat in custody, pale and frightened, while Slack congratulated himself on finding both motive and weapon. Yet Miss Marple felt only the prickle of unease. Too neat, too pat, too quickly tied. The murderer was still free. She was certain of it. She decided that if truth would not come by ordinary questioning, then it must be coaxed by more unconventional means. Human nature, she often said, reveals itself not when it is asked, but when it is caught unawares. And so she devised a small test, half-trap, half-parlor game, that could separate pretense from truth. She asked Colonel Bantry, with his genial authority, to host a gathering in the ballroom under the pretext of reopening the investigation for clarity's sake. Slack agreed reluctantly. He disliked displays that were not of his making, but Miss Marple framed it as a harmless reconstruction. "After all," she said in her mildest tones, "we may have overlooked something, and one never knows, does one?" That evening the suspects assembled once more beneath the painted stars, Fred Pargeter stiff with resentment, Victor Harrow, smooth as a bandmaster, bowing to his audience, the councilman fussing endlessly with his carnation, and the girl in the silver frock, pale and wide-eyed. Lily, released for the occasion under guard, sat apart, clutching her sewing basket. Miss Marple began gently. "I thought," she said, "we might retrace the Starlight Waltz. Perhaps by recalling our movements, we shall remember some little thing." At her request, Colonel Bantry dimmed the lights, leaving only the soft glow of wall sconces. Paper stars collected from the floor were scattered once more, rustling faintly underfoot. The orchestra was absent, but Harrow obligingly hummed. "A bar or two, his voice smooth as varnish. Now," Miss Marple said, "when the lights went out, each of you felt something, whether a touch, a sound, or nothing at all. I should like each to describe it again." They obeyed. The silver-frocked girl repeated her tale of something sticky brushing her cheek. Pargeter said he heard the scream and moved straight to the office. Harrow claimed he was absorbed in keeping the rhythm. The councilman muttered about holding his partner firmly to avoid stumbling. Each account matched what they had already, told Slack. But Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly as she introduced her stratagem. She had taken one of the false paper stars, the green speckled one with its neat puncture, and dusted it, not with glitter, but with a harmless powder of icing sugar. Now as the group stood in semi-darkness, she flicked it lightly into the air with her knitting needle. It drifted down between them, catching the lamplight before settling on the councilman's lapel. He brushed it off with a grunt, but not before his fingers came away faintly sticky. "There now," Miss Marple murmured. "Just like the night of the waltz. A curious sensation, isn't it?" She looked round mildly. Most nodded without concern, but Victor Harrow's smile flickered. Too quick, before returning smooth as ever. It was not the councilman's reaction she had sought. It was Harrow's. He who had no reason to remember the sticky touch had betrayed recognition in that brief lapse of composure. Miss Marple tucked the observation away like a stitch well placed. Next she turned to Lily. "My dear, would you be so good as to show us how you pinned that hem? I think it important." Lily, trembling but obedient, knelt with her basket and drew out her chalk, pins and tape. She marked a line on a scrap of cloth and demonstrated, hands deft despite their shaking. As she did, Miss Marple observed the others closely. Harrow watched with an intensity that belied indifference. Pargeter shifted uneasily as though Lily's skill reminded him of debts unpaid. The girl in silver sighed, impatient at being sidelined. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Now you see," she said softly, "how the chalk dust clings. One cannot handle pins without leaving traces." Her eyes wandered to Harrow again. A faint smear of blue marked his cuff, so slight that only someone searching for it would notice. He had been close enough to the chalk that night, not Lily alone. Finally, Miss Marple produced the bent-nib fountain pen from Mrs. Dalrymple's office. "I wonder," she asked gently, "Which of you lent her this pen? It is not hers. I recall she preferred a heavier nib." She let the silence stretch. The councilman coughed. Pargeter shook his head. The silver-frocked girl looked bewildered. But Harrow, after a heartbeat too long, said smoothly, "She may have borrowed it from the office drawer, I wouldn't know. Too smooth, too ready." Miss Marple smiled to herself. Harrow's family had been entangled with the Dalrymples years ago. His father had suffered disgrace, his name dragged into scandal. Now the son played band leader under Mrs. Dalrymple's authority, humiliated by her sharp tongue and her refusal to forget old debts. He had every reason to wish her silenced, and more reason still to cast suspicion upon the poor seamstress who had once been used as his cover. The trick of the sugared star had not caught the councilman, as Slack might think, but had jolted Harrow into revealing a recognition he ought never to have had. His cuff, dusted faintly with blue, whispered of his nearness to Lily's basket. The bent pen, too easily dismissed, suggested he had fumbled with papers in Mrs. Dalrymple's office before the fatal stroke. Inspector Slack, of course, saw none of this. He declared the reconstruction pointless, grumbling that Miss Marple had wasted everyone's time with toys and trifles. But as the suspects dispersed, Miss Marple's eyes followed Harrow. He smoothed his hair, adjusted his cuff, and smiled at the silver-frocked girl in a way that was meant to reassure. Yet beneath the smile lay the faintest crack, visible only to one accustomed to watching birds startle on a hedge. When all had gone, Miss Marple tucked away her knitting with quiet satisfaction. The unconventional clue, the sugared star, had done its work. It had brushed against deception and left a trace. The murderer had not confessed, nor even stumbled outright, but in the delicate dance of pretense he had missed a step. And to Miss Marple, that was enough. The shadows were thinning. The truth was near. The Starlight Ballroom remained closed, its great mirrored wall shrouded with dust sheets, the paper stars swept into bins, the orchestra dismissed. Inspector Slack had begun to grumble that the case was more trouble than it was worth. But he still clung stubbornly to his solution. Lily Prowse in his eyes was guilty, and the glove from her basket was proof enough. Yet Miss Marple had seen too many tidy proofs unravel like cheap thread. She had intended to examine the glove again, to study the seam where glitter clung and where a reddish stain had been declared blood. The inspector had locked it in, the evidence cabinet at the station, but Miss Marple had persuaded him, by the gentle persistence only an old lady can wield, to let her see it under better light. "One never knows what a careful look might show, Inspector. My eyesight is not what it was, but my memory is still sharp." Slack, exasperated, had agreed to arrange a viewing the next morning. But when the morning came, the glove was gone. The constable on duty swore the cabinet had been locked. The key had not left Slack's pocket. Yet the glove was no longer there. In its place lay only a scrap of paper folded twice, on which someone had scrawled a single word in hurried hand: "Enough." Slack blustered, reddened, and accused his men of incompetence. "Evidence does not walk off by itself," he thundered. "Someone's tampered with it, and that someone had better be found before I lose my patience altogether." To Miss Marple, the matter was more telling than any glove could be. If Lily were guilty, why remove the evidence? The glove, damning as it was, would have sealed her fate. To steal it now only weakened the case against her. No, the glove had served its purpose already. It had been planted to mislead, and now, with suspicion fixed firmly upon Lily, it was whisked away before a closer look could betray the truth. Someone was working carefully, pruning the branches of inquiry to keep the roots hidden. Word of the sway. Missing glove spread quickly, feeding the villagers' gossip. Some whispered that Lily had friends who helped her. Others suggested the inspector himself had mislaid it. A few wondered, uneasily, if the murderer was clever enough to move beneath their very noses. Trust, always fragile in small communities, began to crumble. Neighbors eyed one another warily. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sought quiet corners where truth lingers. She spoke again with Mrs. Tregowan, the cleaner who remembered the cinema days. The woman shook her head gravely. "Not the first time, ma'am. Years ago, when the manager's wife fell down those stairs, there were papers missing after. Accounts, they said. but I always thought it was something more. Papers? Miss Marple asked softly. A ledger, Mrs. Tregowan said. Gone. Overnight. They said it had been mislaid, but I never saw it again, and without it no one could prove how much money had been lost. Here was the pattern again. Evidence disappearing when it pointed the wrong way. Mrs. Dalrymple's death was not an isolated act, but part of a history in which the truth was continually smothered. Later that day, Miss Marple called upon the Bantrys for tea, where she contrived to have Victor Harrow present. He arrived smooth and smiling, offering apologies for the trouble the ballroom had caused. Colonel Bantry, booming as always, pressed him with blunt questions. Harrow parried them with ease, until Miss Marple, with her gentle voice, asked, "Such a pity about the glove. I should have liked to see it again. One wonders why anyone would trouble to take it." For a fraction of a second, Harrow's smile faltered. His hand, steady as a conductor's, tightened around his teacup until the china creaked. "Superstition," he said finally. "People think evidence carries curses, or perhaps the girl's friends tried to save her." His words were smooth, again, but Miss Marple noted the tremor. He was too eager to explain, too quick to place blame elsewhere. That night, another discovery unsettled the fragile calm. The wrong paper star, the green speckled one pierced neatly in the center, was found missing from Inspector Slack's file as well. A constable admitted sheepishly that he had left the office for 5 minutes. In that interval, someone had slipped in and removed it. Slack erupted like a kettle at boil, threatening half the station with dismissal, but Miss Marple was thoughtful. The star, like the glove, had pointed to craft rather than chance. Its disappearance proved its importance. Whoever had taken it feared not the inspector's questions, but hers. The following day, Lily's landlady reported that someone had broken into the girl's room. Drawers were ransacked, her sewing scattered, but nothing stolen save for her old pattern books, pages filled with chalk marks, scraps of fabric, and pins. A curious theft indeed, unless one feared those pages might reveal who had handled them. Piece by piece, the trail was being swept clean. The murderer was not content to let suspicion rest. They were shaping the narrative, trimming away contradictions, and leaving Lily as the only visible culprit. Yet Miss Marple, with her years of village observation, knew that such zeal betrayed panic. A guilty party secure in their disguise would let matters lie, but here was someone desperate, working frantically in the dark. That evening, she walked, alone by the closed ballroom, its windows blank as dead eyes. She thought of the sugar-stiff carnation, the bent pen, the blue chalk on Harrow's cuff. Each had been small, domestic clues, yet now someone fought to erase even those faint traces. And she remembered an old saying from her girlhood, "It is not the innocent who scrub a doorstep at midnight." Inside, Inspector Slack raged about incompetence, but Miss Marple smiled faintly into the twilight. The vanishing evidence had not hindered her. On the contrary, it had sharpened the outline of the truth, for only one person could move so easily among constables, so confidently, in and out of the ballroom, so determined to control the tale. Victor Harrow, the man who turned life into theatre and lies into song. The true danger now was not simply that Lily might be condemned. It was that the murderer, emboldened by success in hiding his traces, might strike again to silence anyone who came too close. Trust was thinning, suspicion thickened like fog. And in that fog, Miss Marple knew another star might fall, this time not from the painted ceiling, but from life itself. She tightened her shawl and walked home. Evidence could vanish, but character could not. The play was not finished, and the murderer, for all his cleverness, had already taken the stage too often. The audience, herself included, would not forget his slips. The stars might be gone. The glove rain streaked the windows of the Bantrys' drawing room, where Miss Marple sat with her knitting, the needles silent for once upon her lap. She had not slept well. Too many thoughts circled like restless birds. The missing glove, the vanished paper star, the desperate haste with which someone was scrubbing the trail clean. Inspector Slack remained obstinate in his certainty about Lily, but Miss Marple felt the murderer's presence as one feels a draught through a closed door. Someone was still moving, still working in the shadows. Her unease proved justified the very next evening. Fred Pargeter, the ballroom's floor manager, was found sprawled in the alley behind the Regal, dead. His body bore no knife wound this time, but a blunt blow to the head, delivered with enough force to still him instantly. The discovery shocked the town afresh. Only hours before, he had been seen in the grocer's, speaking bitterly about Mrs. Dalrymple's death and declaring that the place was cursed. Now he lay lifeless in the rain, his cap knocked into the gutter. Inspector Slack blustered at the scene. Suicide? No, murder. But why kill him if the girl's already to blame? Unless... His voice faltered. The theory of Lily's solitary guilt no longer fit. The town that had begun to nod along with Slack's tidy conclusion now buzzed again with dread. Miss Marple bent slowly over the body, her handkerchief neat in her hand. The cap fascinated her. It was crushed oddly, not from the fall, but as if someone had gripped it hard in a struggle, and in the brim she found a faint smear, blue, like chalk. She remembered Lily's thumb that first night, dusted with the same powder. Pargeter's killer, like Mrs. Dalrymple's, had brushed against the world of dressmaking. The inspector growled. What was he doing out here anyway? A meeting, perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. When people fear secrets will come out. They often arrange meetings in dark places, and then when they find themselves too near the truth, someone ensures they will not speak again. That night the ballroom's shadow deepened. With Pargeter's death, suspicion shifted wildly. The councilman muttered that Pargeter had been blackmailing Mrs. Dalrymple. The silver-frocked girl whispered that he had threatened her too. Victor Harrow spoke of him with sorrowful disdain, calling him a man out of his depth. Each explanation made Pargeter look more guilty, more deserving of fate. But Miss Marple heard the same note in all of them: relief. The next day, a commotion rose at the station. Lily Prowse had vanished. A constable swore she had been safely locked in her cell overnight, but come morning the door stood ajar. The lock had not been broken. It had been opened with a key. Inspector Slack was beside himself. First a stolen glove, now a vanished prisoner. My whole station made a fool of. She's guilty, she's run, that proves it. But Miss Marple shook her head. No, Inspector, that proves only that someone wished her gone. If she had run, of her own accord, why leave behind her sewing basket? For there it sat neatly placed in the corner of her cell, its contents undisturbed. Not the act of a girl in flight, but of someone tidying after her. The murderer had stolen Lily, not freed her. The town rippled with fear. 2 deaths, 1 disappearance. Suddenly the ballroom's tragedy no longer seemed confined to one unlucky night. A sense of danger seeped into every corner, and doors were locked earlier than ever before. Miss Marple pondered in silence. The murderer was not finished. He had silenced Mrs. Dalrymple, erased evidence, struck down Pargeter when he threatened to speak, and now removed Lily, whose innocence might yet have come to light. It was a pattern of control, a hand shaping every turn of the story, and she thought again of Harrow's flicker of recognition when the sugared star had brushed the councilman's lapel of the blue chalk on his cuff. That evening, Miss Marple invited Harrow, the councilman, and the silver-frocked girl to tea at the Bantries. She spoke gently, as if it were no more than neighbourly civility. I thought, she said, that after so much gloom, it would be pleasant to take a little comfort together. Her eyes, bright though hidden behind spectacles, missed nothing. She produced a folded scrap of green-speckled paper. Another star, cut that afternoon from pattern tissue, pierced at the centre. I do so like keepsakes, she said, handing it to the girl. They remind one of special nights. The girl blanched, her hand trembling. She looked instinctively to Harrow, whose calm mask tightened just for a moment. He covered it swiftly, with a smile. You have a taste for the dramatic, Miss Marple, but surely these trifles mean nothing. On the contrary, Miss Marple said softly, they mean everything. People forget that the smallest scraps often tell the largest tales, and whoever killed Mrs. Dalrymple has been working very hard indeed to sweep away those scraps. Yet scraps have a way of clinging like sugar on silk. Harrow rose too quickly, setting down his teacup with a clink. The councilman frowned, uneasy, while the girl looked as though she longed to speak but dared not. Miss Marple saw it all, the he. Evening broke up shortly after, Harrow bowing himself out with more grace than sincerity. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, thoughtful. The murderer had shown his hand again. Pargeter's death, Lily's disappearance, the faint cracks in Harrow's composure, each was a step in a pattern. The twist was clear. The case was far from over. It was not one murder to be solved, but a chain of crimes, each linked by old resentments and present desperation. The murderer was still ahead, shaping the tale, striking out at anyone who might disturb the performance. Miss Marple folded her knitting away, her lips tightening into a line. She had spent her life watching human nature, and she knew the end of this play would not be long delayed. The killer had grown reckless. Another crime had already struck like a warning bell, and unless she acted swiftly, there would be yet another star to fall in the Starlight Ballroom, destroyed. But the truth still shone, waiting for the moment when no hand could hide it. The town lived in a hush. Pargeter's murder had shaken even those who had swallowed Inspector Slack's story whole. The ballroom that only days before glittered with music and dancing was now spoken of in whispers, as if the painted stars on its ceiling were unlucky constellations that drew death down upon whoever lingered there too long. Lily Prowse's disappearance added to the sense of dread. An innocent girl carried off as though the earth itself had swallowed her. Slack thundered and blustered, but his certainty no longer rang true. Miss Marple, however, sat with her knitting, in quiet thought, unhurried as always, for she knew that chaos often revealed patterns to those patient enough to wait. It was a small remark that stirred the first thread loose. Colonel Bantry, who never knew when to keep a thought to himself, complained over breakfast that Harrow's orchestra always played too smooth, never a note out of place, like a fellow polishing apples with paraffin to make them shine. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She remembered something then, something the silver-frocked girl had said the night of the murder, that when the star brushed her cheek, it had felt sticky, as if dipped in syrup. At the time it had seemed odd. Now, paired with Bantry's remark, the stickiness gained new meaning. A man who liked surfaces polished and perfect would not mind sugaring a paper star to make it behave on cue. That thought unlocked another. The glove in Lily's basket, so damning, so perfectly placed, had been at the very top. Miss Marple pictured again Lily's work-basket, a muddle of pins and fabric, chalk and scraps. For such a glove to be placed neatly on top, glitter and stain conveniently exposed, someone had staged it deliberately. It was not evidence discovered, it was evidence exhibited, just like Harrow's Starlight Waltz, with its planned blackout and falling stars. The glove was theatre. Miss Marple laid down her knitting and fetched her notes, scraps of observations scribbled in her neat hand. She underlined 3 things: the sugared star, the glove on top of the basket, the bent pen from Mrs. Dalrymple's desk. All of them were tricks, small manipulations designed for effect, and all bore the touch of someone who understood performance. Then she recalled a tiny gesture, overlooked at the time. When Harrow had been questioned, he smoothed his cuff repeatedly, as though adjusting it. She had thought it mere nervousness. But when she remembered the faint smear of blue chalk, she had glimpsed on that cuff during the reconstruction, the gesture took on new meaning. He had been trying to brush it away, to conceal a trace. The pattern grew clearer. Every piece of evidence that incriminated Lily had, in fact, passed through Harrow's hands. He had access to her basket when she rushed on stage. He had planned the blackout which gave him the cover of darkness. He had arranged the falling stars, one of which, oddly green-speckled, was not like the others. He had even guided the orchestra, ensuring the music concealed any stray cry that was not part of the performance. And then came the memory that pulled all threads tight. Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Tregowan, the old cleaner, telling her of the cinema days, when the manager's wife had died in that same office, and a ledger of debts had gone missing. The name Harrow had been whispered then too. A family entangled, with Dalrymple scandal, humiliated, ruined. Victor Harrow had not appeared in Starlight by accident. He had come carrying shadows of the past, waiting for the moment when a performance might turn into revenge. Miss Marple's thoughts grew sharper. Pargeter had been silenced, not because he was guilty, but because he knew too much. Perhaps he had recognized the tricks for what they were. Lily had been taken not because she killed, but because she could prove she hadn't. And through it all, Harrow had conducted the scene like a symphony, shifting suspicion from one player to the next until only his music sounded clear. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the ballroom, now locked and guarded. She persuaded the constable on duty, with the gentle authority only an elderly lady can muster, to let her into the office once more. The desk sat as it had, ledgers piled neatly, papers stacked. But on the inside of the drawer she noticed a faint glitter pressed into the wood grain where fingers had once fumbled. A man used to scattering stars might forget that traces linger, even where audiences do not look. When she left, the rain had cleared, and sunlight caught the wet cobbles. The light seemed to illuminate her certainty. The pattern had been there, all along hidden in plain sight as most patterns are. Harrow was not merely a band leader with charm. He was a man with a family history of humiliation, a taste for theatre, and a hand skilled at planting evidence as deftly as notes on a stave. He had used spectacle to conceal his crime, just as surely as he used music to drown whispers. Borisio. Evening at the Bantries, Miss Marple said nothing of her conclusion aloud. She simply folded her knitting carefully into its basket. But inside she felt the calm that comes when a tangled skein is finally unknotted. She knew now that the murders and disappearances were not chaos at all. They were a performance, orchestrated by a single man who could not resist staging every detail. The pattern had emerged: glitter, chalk, sugar, glove, pen, all props in his theatre of murder. The key had been in front of them from the first night, the idea of performance, of spectacle. A ballroom turned theatre, a blackout turned stage curtain, a scream rehearsed like a line. Harrow had written the play, and everyone else had been cast without knowing it. Miss Marple leaned back, her expression mild, as Colonel Bantry thundered about Slack's incompetence, and Mrs. Bantry speculated about Lily's fate. She knew the endgame was near. The murderer had played his notes beautifully, but even the best performance must reach its finale. And when the curtain fell, it would be Miss Marple, not Harrow, who would write the closing line. The following. Morning dawned bright, the kind of morning that ought to have carried freshness and cheer. But in the village the air felt heavy, taut with the silence of neighbours who no longer trusted one another. Doors were kept bolted, curtains twitched nervously, and the very name of the Starlight Ballroom sent a shiver down spines. For now it was not merely a ballroom, it was a place of death. Inspector Slack tramped through the Bantry's drawing room with the irritation of a man whose case had slipped from his grasp. Lily was still missing, Pargita lay buried, and whispers about Harrow began to ripple, though he stubbornly refused to believe them. Miss Marple sat quietly in her chair, hands folded neatly, her knitting untouched. She knew the time had come to look beneath the glitter, past the easy story of jealousy or greed. The real reason, she felt it, was deeper, darker, and infinitely more dangerous. The clue lay not in the glove, nor in the paper stars, but in the pattern she had uncovered. Harrow's hand lay behind every piece of theatre. But why? Money could not explain it. Mrs. Dalrymple was not wealthy. Her takings were modest, her accounts precise. Nor could power be the reason. Harrow had charm enough to command the ballroom already. Revenge for old family debts, yes, but there was a fervour in his eyes whenever her name was spoken that hinted at something more. Miss Marple sought answers in the past. She visited Mrs. Tregowan again, who gladly unburdened herself over a pot of weak tea. "I told you before, ma'am, about the manager's wife, how she died in that office long ago. Well, there's more. That woman, she was said to be keeping company with a young man who played in the orchestra. A Harrow, he was, Victor's father, or perhaps an uncle. Folk said she meant to run away with him, leave her husband to face ruin alone. But she never got the chance, did she? Dead before she could pack her bag. The story was hushed, of course, but those things linger." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. A forbidden romance, a scandal smothered in whispers. A death declared, an accident. And now, decades later, Victor Harrow standing in the same ballroom, orchestrating death with the same sense of spectacle. It was not money alone that had driven him, nor even the sting of disgrace. It was inheritance, an inheritance not of gold but of bitterness. Later that day she spoke to the silver-frocked girl, coaxing her with gentleness. At first the girl resisted, but under Miss Marple's steady gaze, the truth spilled out in fragments. He told me she mocked him. That Mrs. Dalrymple laughed, said he was just another Harrow bound to end in scandal like his father. He said she would destroy him if he crossed her. He couldn't bear it. Her eyes brimmed with tears. He wanted to prove her wrong, to prove to everyone that Harrows don't crawl. They strike. There it was, the motive stripped bare. Not simple revenge, not greed, but an obsession born of humiliation buried deep in the family's past. Victor Harrow carried not only his own pride, but the bruises of a father disgraced, and a love story ended in tragedy. The ballroom for him was not a place of dancing. It was a stage upon which he might rewrite history, where he could turn shame into triumph. And Mrs. Dalrymple, sharp-tongued and shrewd, had threatened to snatch that stage from under him. Her words, scornful, dismissive, had struck at the raw wound he carried all his life. Miss Marple saw it now with dreadful clarity. To Harrow, killing Mrs. Dalrymple was not just silencing an enemy, it was symbolic. He had chosen the blackout, the stars, the theatrical scream, because he was not merely committing murder, he was composing a performance, an act to erase the memory of a father's disgrace. Every planted glove, every sugared star was part of the drama. Pargeter's death, Lily's disappearance, those were not inconveniences but encores, scenes added when the audience threatened to see too clearly. Inspector Slack, of course, blustered when Miss Marple shared her suspicions. Psychology, old scandals, you'd have me chasing shadows. Murder is about opportunity, plain and simple, but Miss Marple only smiled her gentle smile. No, Inspector. Murder is about people. And people carry their wounds longer than their purses. A purse may empty and fill again, but humiliation, that never quite fades. It festers, and in some hearts it grows into something monstrous. That evening, as dusk fell and the town held its breath, Miss Marple walked once more to the ballroom. She stood in the great mirrored hall, dim with dust and silence, and let her gaze rest on the painted ceiling. Stars stared down at her, faded but watchful. She thought of Harrow, the boy who grew up hearing whispers of his father's disgrace, the man who fashioned life into theatre, the murderer who believed that killing under falling stars could wash away the shame of years. The motive was hidden not in ledgers or love affairs, but in the mind. Harrow's crime was not only murder, it was a desperate bid to rewrite his family's story. That was why he silenced Pargeter, who might expose the trick. That was why he removed Lily, who symbolized innocence that could not be framed. That was why he scrubbed away evidence again and again. For Harrow was not content merely to escape punishment. He needed the play to end on his terms, with the audience applauding his cleverness, never mocking him again. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, as though in prayer. She had seen many kinds of crime in her life, but there was always something chilling in those born of pride and shame. For they had no bottom. They would go as far as needed. When she returned to the Bantry's drawing room, she said nothing of her conclusions, only resumed her knitting with steady hands. The pattern was clear, the motive revealed, and the end game was near. The truth was no longer hidden. It was waiting, poised, like the final note in a song, and Miss Marple knew that when it sounded, Victor Harrow's theatre would collapse not in triumph, but in ruin. For the stars he scattered had betrayed him, and the stage he built would become the gallows of his own making. The evening chosen for the confrontation was damp, the kind of English evening where fog draped itself across the streets like a curtain, waiting to be drawn. The Starlight Ballroom, shuttered and silent since the deaths, loomed at the center of the town's unease. Its painted stars no longer seemed festive. They were sinister now, reminders of the night when laughter turned to screams. Miss Marple, however, insisted that the confrontation must take place there. If one begins a play beneath painted stars, she had said quietly, it must also end there. Inspector Slack grumbled, but with Colonel Bantry's support, he agreed to gather the suspects once more. And so, as darkness deepened, the familiar faces assembled in that echoing hall. The silver-frocked girl, pale as her dress, the councilman, carnations drooping on his lapel, Lily Prowse, released from her brief imprisonment but guarded still by constables, and Victor Harrow, immaculate as ever, his smile fixed with theatrical ease. Miss Marple stood near the bandstand, her shawl folded neatly, her knitting bag at her feet. Her small figure seemed out of place amid the grandeur, yet all eyes were upon her. For though Slack had called them there, it was she whom they watched. She began softly, her voice steady as a metronome. "We have lived with confusion these past days, one death then another, and evidence vanishing as quickly as it appeared. But I think now we may look at matters with clarity." Her eyes rested on Harrow. Mrs. Dalrymple's murder was no simple crime of jealousy or money. It was theatre, staged in darkness with sugared stars with screams rehearsed like lines. Mr. Harrow, you arranged that performance. You alone had the means to scatter stars, to control the lights, to turn a murder into spectacle. Harrow laughed softly, a polished sound, though it rang hollow in the empty hall. "Really, Miss Marple, you give me too much credit. I conduct music, not murders." "Ah," Miss Marple said gently, "but your cuff that night bore blue chalk from Lily's basket, and the bent pen found in Mrs. Dalrymple's office had been yours. You dropped it when you rifled her ledger. And when I sent a sugared star drifting across the room the other evening, you alone recognized the touch before it was explained. Small things, Mr. Harrow, but murder often reveals itself in the smallest of things." The silver-frocked girl gave a gasp, half stifled. Harrow shot her a sharp glance, one that spoke more eloquently than denial. Miss Marple pressed on, her tone as mild as if she were explaining a recipe. "You killed Mrs. Dalrymple, not only because she threatened your position, but because her scorn awoke something older. Years ago, your father's disgrace, his entanglement with a woman in this very place, left your family mocked and ruined. You have lived with that shadow all your life. Mrs. Dalrymple mocked you too, called you just another Harrow bound for scandal. You could not endure it. So you staged a performance to avenge not only yourself but your father. You wanted the whole town to be misled, to clap at your cleverness while the truth remained hidden. Pargeter saw too much. You silenced him. Lily's innocence threatened. You took her away, and all the while you believed you conducted the play." The silence in the ballroom was heavy. Slack shifted awkwardly, his pencil frozen above his notebook. The councilman coughed uncertain. Lily's wide eyes brimmed with tears. Harrow's smile faltered, then hardened. "You are an old woman with too much imagination. Where is your proof? Paper stars and chalk dust? That would not convict a man in any court." Miss Marple inclined her head. Perhaps not alone. But when Lily was found, her sewing basket was untouched, except for the glove placed neatly on top. That was not her work. Today, when the constables searched your rooms, they found more paper stars cut from pattern tissue, pierced neatly at the center, the same kind as the false one discovered in Mrs. Dalrymple's office. She paused, letting the words sink in. "And that, Mr. Harrow, is proof enough." For the first time, Harrow's poise cracked. His eyes darted, his hand twitched toward the door. The constables stiffened, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "No need to run, Mr. Harrow. You have nowhere to go. The play is over." Harrow's laugh came sharp, edged with desperation. "Over? No. You think you've trapped me with scraps and memories, but I—" He broke off, for the silver-frocked girl had risen, her voice trembling but clear. "It's true, I helped him. He told me it was just a trick, that no one would be hurt. He said Mrs. Dalrymple only needed a fright. But when the lights came on—" She buried her face in her hands. "I saw the blood. And then he made me. Swear to scream, to keep the act alive. I was too afraid not to." The room shuddered with the weight of her confession. Harrow's mask shattered then. He lunged toward her, hand raised, not in violence but in a futile attempt to silence. The constables closed in, pinning his arms before he reached her. He struggled, but his strength was no match for theirs. Miss Marple remained composed, her voice soft as falling rain. You see, Mr. Harrow, theatre cannot conceal human nature. No curtain can hide it, no orchestra can drown it. The smallest details, chalk, sugar, a misplaced glove, betray the truth. Your stagecraft was clever, but human pride is cleverer still. It always leaves a trace. Harrow sagged then, his defiance draining away. She mocked me, he muttered, eyes wild. All of them mocked me. My father's name. Dragged through. Dirt. I only wanted them to see that a Harrow could not be trampled, that we could strike back. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. But you see, Mr. Harrow, revenge never lifts a name. It only buries it deeper. Your family story will not be rewritten. It will end here in disgrace because you chose blood where you might have chosen grace. The ballroom seemed colder then, the silence broken only by the scrape of the constable's boots as they led Harrow away. The painted stars on the ceiling glimmered faintly in the lamplight, like witnesses to the final act. Inspector Slack cleared his throat, awkward and grudging. Well, Miss Marple, I suppose you've done it again. I thought you were chasing. Fairy tales, but you had the truth all along. Miss Marple only smiled, her needles clicking once more as she gathered her knitting. Oh no, Inspector, it was not fairy tales. Only the small ordinary things people overlook. Murder, after all, is very ordinary. One only needs to see the pattern. And with that, she stepped out into the foggy night, leaving the starlight. Ballroom behind, a place where stars had once fallen, where theatre had turned to tragedy and where at last the curtain had come down. The village breathed easier after Victor Harrow was led away in handcuffs. The Starlight Ballroom remained closed, of course, its painted stars dimmed and its dance floor empty, but at least there was comfort in believing the murderer had been caught. Inspector Slack wore the air of a man vindicated, despite the fact that Miss Marple's deductions had been the true lever that toppled Harrow's mask. Colonel Bantry congratulated her heartily, and Mrs. Bantry whispered that the whole thing had been positively Shakespearean. Miss Marple, however, did not celebrate. She had seen too many endings to trust them on first appearance. Murder rarely lays down its final card without a flourish. And as she returned to her quiet guest room that night, a thought troubled her. Why had Harrow kept pressing Lily into the spotlight? He could have framed anyone, but he chose her. Was it simply convenience, or something more deliberate? Her answer arrived the next morning, delivered in the most ordinary way. A constable knocked at the Bantry's door, pale and shaken. During a search of Harrow's belongings, they had found a letter tucked in the lining of his violin case. It was unsigned, written in a woman's hand, and it read, "You will have your revenge, but remember, she must bear the blame, not you. I will see to the rest." Miss Marple's knitting slipped from her lap. The letter had not been written by Harrow. It had been written to him. Someone had nudged him toward murder, perhaps even arranged the pieces for him. He had been an instrument, not the conductor. At once her mind flew back to the silver-frocked girl. Her scream at the precise moment of the blackout, her trembling confession that Harrow had made her act, her glance to him, always to him, as though waiting for a signal. But there had been more. Her eyes had often strayed to Lily too, lingering in a way that spoke of envy sharpened by something deeper. Miss Marple asked quietly to speak with the girl again. The constables brought her, still pale and fearful, and sat her in the Bantry's drawing-room. Miss Marple, with her usual mildness, began not with accusations, but with sympathy. "You must have suffered dreadfully, my dear, caught between Harrow's demands and your own conscience." The girl's eyes filled with tears. I only wanted to dance. He promised me the demonstration waltz, the stars, the applause, but she, Mrs. Dalrymple, said I wasn't ready. She mocked me in front of everyone. And so, Miss Marple said gently, you encouraged him. A word here, a letter there. You did not strike the blow, but you set the scene. You knew Harrow's pride, his wounded family name. You knew what string to pluck, and you plucked it. The scream, too. Ah, yes, that was rehearsed between you, wasn't it? But you made it your own at just the right pitch to fix suspicion elsewhere. It was not Harrow who chose Lily as the scapegoat. It was you. The girl's composure broke. She always had the attention. Even Lily, with her plain frocks and her sewing chalk, people pitied her, admired her work. And me? Nothing, unless I danced. Mrs. Dalrymple meant to replace me after the opening, to give the waltz to another girl. I couldn't bear it. I wanted my moment, and I wanted her gone. Her voice grew sharp, feverish. Victor thought it was his idea, but it was mine. I gave him the words. I told him she would laugh at him, mock him, that he must act, and he believed me. He always believed me. Inspector Slack, who had blundered into the room midway, gaped like a man slapped with a wet fish. You're saying he wasn't the mastermind?" Miss Marple nodded calmly. "No, Inspector. He was the hand, she was the voice. Without her urging, he might have fumed and plotted, but never struck. She shaped the play, even if he played the lead." The councilman with the carnation, present by accident, gave a low whistle. "Good Lord. All for a waltz and a bit of applause?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. "Never underestimate the hunger for recognition. A young girl overlooked may grow desperate, and desperation will lend itself to cruelty if flattered by opportunity." The silver-frocked girl broke down then, sobbing into her hands, her glittering dress dulled by tears. Slack ordered her taken into custody, muttering about confounded theatricals. When the room emptied, Mrs. Bantry whispered, "However did you see it, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It was the scream, you see. It came too perfectly, like a line delivered on stage. Harrow was a man of theatre, yes, but she was the one who played to the audience. And when evidence vanished, it vanished in ways that hurt Lily, but left her untouched. That was not Harrow's doing. That was hers. And so the case ended not with Harrow alone, but with the revelation that the true mastermind had been the overlooked girl in the silver frock, her ambition and envy sharper than any knife. Harrow had been driven by old wounds, but she had driven him, whispering, guiding, scripting the final act. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking softly. She reflected, not without sadness, that the most shocking motives were often the simplest, the longing to be seen, the bitterness of being ignored. In the end, it had not been money or power, but vanity, hungry, desperate vanity, that had turned a dance into a dirge. The ballroom would reopen one day, its mirrors polished and its stars glowing once more. But those who danced there would remember always the night when envy and pride wrote a darker tune, and when two killers stood behind the curtain, one with a knife, the other with a whisper. The courtroom in the market town was crowded to bursting, the air thick with damp coats, whispers, and the faint smell of ink from the clerks' desks. Victor Harrow stood at the dock, his hair no longer slicked with oil, his charm stripped to a pale mask. Beside him, the silver-frocked girl twisted a handkerchief until it frayed. Inspector Slack sat in the front row, red-faced with both triumph and unease, while Colonel and Mrs. Bantry watched with the avidity of those who had been part of the drama from its start. And in a modest chair near the back, Miss Marple folded her hands primly in her lap, eyes mild, mind sharp. The charges had been laid out, the murder of Mrs. Dalrymple, the silencing of Fred Pargeter, and the abduction of Lily Prowse. The evidence was not grand or spectacular, but small and cumulative. The glove planted in Lily's basket, the sugared paper star, the blue chalk on Harrow's cuff, and the letter found in his violin case. To the jury it seemed bewildering, a patchwork of trifles. Yet to Miss Marple those trifles told a single story. When she was called to speak, she did not falter. Her voice, thin but steady, carried across the room. "It is the small things, you. See," she began, "that tell the truth when larger things are made to deceive. From the beginning, Mr. Harrow wished us to see a performance, the blackout, the falling stars, the rehearsed scream. But murder is never theatre, Inspector Slack, however it may be dressed. Murder leaves traces of the ordinary. Chalk from a towel. Seamstress's hand glitter in the wrong place, sugar clinging where it ought not. Those are what I looked for." She explained step by step how the stars had been prepared with sugar so they would cling, how the glove had been planted on top of Lily's muddled basket to frame her, how Harrow's cuff betrayed his nearness. To the chalk, how Pargeter had been silenced when he began to suspect the trick. The jurors leaned forward, rapt, as the muddle of scraps became a net tightening round Harrow. Then she turned very gently toward the girl in the silver frock. "And yet," she said softly, The true stage director was not Mr. Harrow alone. He carried his father's bitterness, yes, but it was you, my dear, who pressed him to act. You whispered that Mrs. Dalrymple mocked him. You played upon his wounds. You promised him your devotion if only he proved himself. You rehearsed your scream to perfection, so that in the darkness suspicion would fall elsewhere. You did not wield the knife, but you wielded something sharper, his pride. The girl trembled, tears glistening. "I never meant—" she began, but her voice broke. Miss Marple inclined her head. "I know, few ever mean the end when they take the first step. But once begun, it runs away with you." The judge's gavel struck, voices rose, and the clerk read the charges anew. Harrow was found guilty, his shoulders sagging as the verdict fell like a final curtain. The girl, though not charged with. The stabbing itself was judged complicit. Her letters and encouragement had steered Harrow to the act. She was sentenced too, though more lightly. Justice, in its blunt way, had been served. And yet, as the crowd spilled into the street, relief mingling with gossip, Miss Marple sat very still. Slack puffed himself up like a rooster. "All's well, Miss Marple, eh? Case tied in a bow." "Justice done," she smiled faintly. "Yes, Inspector, justice of a kind." But in her mind lingered the image of Lily Prowse, pale, exhausted, yet free at last from suspicion. She had been a pawn in the play, framed not for her guilt, but for her vulnerability. And Miss Marple thought of Harrow's final words when led away. "They will never stop mocking us," words not of a man cowed, but of one still burning with grievance. Even in defeat, he had clung to his theatre. That evening, she walked once more past the shuttered ballroom. The windows were blank, the stars on the painted ceiling invisible in the dark. Yet she felt their presence faint and watchful. The place would reopen someday. Life had a way of resuming its gaiety. But for those who had lived through it, the music would always carry an undertone of menace, the glitter a memory of blood. Mrs. Bantry pressed her for comfort. "At least it's finished now, Jane." Miss Marple folded her shawl closer about her shoulders. Finished, yes, and yet not finished. For what drove them was not only pride or ambition, but something deeper, a hunger to be seen, to be applauded, to matter in a world that had mocked or ignored them. That hunger, I fear, does not die in a courtroom. It lingers, waiting for another stage, another player. Her words hung in the quiet street like a chill. For justice, though served, never quite mended the wound that had given rise to murder. The Harrow's bitterness, the girl's vanity, Mrs. Dalrymple's scorn, they were threads in a tapestry that would never be unpicked entirely. And so Miss Marple, with her mild smile and her sharp eyes, walked slowly back to the Bantrys. She had shown once more that the smallest details told the greatest truths, that the quiet eye saw what the clamorous missed. Yet even she knew that justice is rarely perfect, and closure is a comfort more than a fact. The Starlight Ballroom stood, in silence, its stage empty, its stars dim. But in its shadows lay the echo of a waltz that had turned to murder, and of a truth revealed only because one elderly lady saw what no one else cared to see. The verdict had been read, the gavel had fallen, and the town once more breathed in relief. Victor Harrow and the girl in the silver frock were gone from the village, carried off in a prison cart under a grey sky. The Starlight Ballroom stood shuttered, its windows blind, its mirrored wall gathering dust. Inspector Slack, puffed with self-importance, declared that the matter was closed, while neighbours who had avoided one another for days returned to gossiping over fences and queuing in the grocer's with their old ease. But Miss Marple, though she shared tea with the Bantrys and allowed herself to smile when Mrs. Bantry praised her genius, did not feel quite settled. She had seen too many endings to believe in tidy bows. Murder, in her experience, always left a thread, dangling, a question unanswered, a whisper not quite silenced. That evening, as she walked alone past the shuttered ballroom, she paused. A notice had been nailed to the door, premises closed by order of the council. The paper flapped in the wind, but what caught her eye was something smaller, wedged in the crack of the frame. A paper star, brittle now, dulled by dust. She plucked it free, turning it over in her fingers. Unlike the sugared stars of Harrow's trick, this one bore no glitter, no chalky smear, but in the center was a neat puncture hole. "Curious," she murmured. "All the stars should have been swept away." The constables had collected them as evidence. Slack had sworn nothing remained, yet here was another, tucked where no one had thought to look. Why? Had it slipped through the cracks by chance, or had someone placed it there deliberately? A calling card, a reminder. She carried it back to the Bantry's drawing room, where the Colonel was dozing and Mrs. Bantry fussed with a tray. She set the star upon the table, its edges curling. Mrs. Bantry peered at it and shuddered. "Oh, Jane, I thought we'd seen the last of those horrid things. Do burn it." But Miss Marple only smiled faintly. "One must be careful what one burns, dear, for sometimes ashes conceal more than flames reveal." Later, as she tucked the star into her knitting bag, she recalled Harrow's last words when he was led from the dock. "They will never stop mocking us. Someone will carry it on." At the time, it had sounded like the ravings of a man cornered. Now, with the star in her hand, she wondered if it had been something more. A hint, a promise, or perhaps a warning. Lily Prowse came to see her the next day, pale but free at last of suspicion. She wept her thanks, and Miss Marple comforted her with tea and a slice of seed cake. But as the girl bent to retrieve her sewing basket, Miss Marple noticed something odd. The basket, muddled as ever with pins and thread, still carried a faint trace of sugar dusting the lining. Lily saw it too and frowned. "I never put that there," she whispered. "Of course not, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "It was placed there for you to carry suspicion." Yet inside she thought, if Harrow and the girl are both gone, then who placed this last trace? Inspector Slack, when told, brushed it aside with his usual bluster. "Leftover rubbish, that's all." "Don't go stirring ghosts, Miss Marple. The case is closed." But Miss Marple knew better. Ghosts do not stir themselves. Someone had left that star. Someone had placed that dust. Someone who had not been caught. Perhaps they were no murderer, not yet. Perhaps only a watcher, an accomplice, or a shadow in the wings. But they existed, and they might step forward when the stage was set once more. On her final evening in the village before returning to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple walked slowly through the market square. The lamps glowed softly, shop shutters were drawn, and the rain had ceased. She carried her knitting bag on her arm, and within it the paper star lay folded between skeins of wool. At the edge of the square she passed two boys playing marbles. One boy bent, and as he did a phrase drifted on the damp air, a rhyme chanted like a skipping song. "Stars fall down and secrets hide. The ballroom keeps them all inside." Miss Marple paused, her heart giving a small, startled beat. "Where? Did you hear that?" she asked gently. The boys shrugged. "Everyone says it. It's a song now." "A song," Miss Marple repeated softly. She walked on, her mind turning. Children often carried scraps of truth in their games, echoes of things, overheard. Somewhere someone had started that rhyme. Somewhere someone wanted the memory of the Starlight Ballroom to live on, not as tragedy, but as legend. She reached the Bantry's gate, the lamps casting pale halos in the mist. She stood for a moment, looking back toward the shuttered hall, its black windows blank against the night. The case was solved, yes. Justice had been served in the way courts and juries declare it. But still the star in her knitting bag glimmered faintly in her thoughts. Still the rhyme lingered on the children's lips. "A mystery," she murmured, "never quite ends. It only waits, like a seed in the ground, for the right season to sprout again." And with that she went inside, smiling her mild smile, the picture of an elderly lady ready for bed. But behind her gentle eyes lay the certainty that somewhere, hidden in the village's quiet lanes, another thread was already spinning, waiting for her sharp needles to unpick. The Starlight Ballroom was silent, yes. But silence, Miss Marple knew, was never the same as peace.